Well, hey, Dr. Caffey. Richie Ford here. Good to be with you here on a chilly night as I stoke up the stove. Well, the character I chose to evaluate within 1 Samuel chapters 1 through 7 is Samuel. I've always been amazed at the response of Samuel to the Lord when he learns that it is the Lord, not Eli, calling out to him in 1 Samuel chapter 3. The response of, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening," is a response and a heart attitude that I believe we should all have as a follower of Jesus. The question is, what are the circumstances that produced such a humble, honest servant of the Lord? Are there events that occur within the life of Samuel that we can see here in these 7 chapters that we as interpreters can study so that we too can say, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening"? I believe the answer is yes. But to arrive at what those events are, we first must look at the overall narrative of 1 Samuel 1 through 7 to assess what is going on and how Samuel fits within that narrative. Robert Bergen, author of the New American Commentary on 1 and 2 Samuel, says it well on page 57 in regards to the overall plot of these 7 chapters, and I quote, he says, "The opening 7 chapters of 1 Samuel trace the rise of Samuel and the downfall of the house of Eli, the priest whose 2 evil sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are also serving as priests." We see the rise of Samuel actually begin with Samuel's mother, Hannah. Hannah was one of the 2 wives of Elkanah, Samuel's father. The text begins by painting the situation here in chapter 1 of 1 Samuel that Hannah is berated and belittled by Elkanah's other wife, Peninnah, because Hannah's womb is barren. In Hannah's desperation, she cries out to the Lord in verse 11 of chapter 1, promising to the Lord that if he were to give her a child, she would dedicate him to the Lord for his entire life. After her prayer, the priest Eli sends her on her way with a blessing, saying in verse 17 of chapter 1, "May the God of Israel grant the request you have asked of him." The rest of chapter 1 tells us that God did grant Hannah's request. God gave her a son, and she named him Samuel. In verse 28, we see Hannah keeping her promise, bringing Samuel to the tabernacle to serve the Lord for the duration of his life. And here we already see a main event that can cause us as modern believers to say, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." And I believe it's this: a humble dependence on the Lord with a heart attitude that doesn't hold tightly to his gifts, but rather holds them loosely. In many ways, Samuel is the protagonist of this text here in these 7 chapters, the hero that God's people are in desperate need of, due to the great evil Eli's sons are leading Israel with. In fact, it is within the great evil Eli's 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are leading God's people with, that we see God raising up Samuel. Chapter 2, verse 18 tells us Samuel was already serving the Lord as a boy. Chapter 3 shows the great sensitivity Samuel has for the Lord, responding to the Lord's call with, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." We then see Samuel's faithfulness in relaying difficult information to Eli that God is judging Eli and his family for the great evil they have led Israel with. It is at this point, the text here tells us that Samuel was confirmed as a prophet of the Lord. According to the Greek-English lexicon of the New Testament on page 890, a prophet is, and I quote, "a proclaimer or expounder of divine matters or concerns that could not ordinarily be known except by special revelation." Samuel was already recognized as this at the end of chapter 3. This dynamic hero God's people needed, considering the great evil the house of Eli was leading God's people with. According to the Lexham Bible Dictionary by Daniel Diffie and Miles Custis under Samuel the prophet, Samuel's main role here was, yes, that of prophet, although he did serve many roles, including seer, priest, judge, and father, because he was, and I quote, a transitional figure between the time of the judges and the inauguration of the monarchy. Chapter 4 tells us of the death of Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, as well as their father, Eli. According to Bergen, cited earlier on page 58, and I quote, their destruction comes from the Lord, the result of sinful conduct while administrating over Israel's holiest shrine. A 20-year period then passes where we do not hear of Samuel's name. These two chapters, 5 and 6, detail the Philistines capturing the Ark of the Covenant and then returning it to God's people. According to Walter Elwell and Barry J. Beitzel in Baker Encyclopedia of the Bible, under Samuel person on page 1891, and I quote, Samuel probably during this time also founded schools of the prophets. During this period, a natural outgrowth of Samuel's ministry. Chapter 7 ends with Samuel standing as judge over Israel, helping form peace between Israel and the Amorites. We see this in verse 14 of chapter 7. What then is the takeaway? To cultivate an attitude of, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. We, like Hannah and Samuel, must have a humble dependence on the Lord, with a heart attitude that does not hold tightly to God's gifts, but rather holds them loosely. This is the fertile ground, I believe, needed to cultivate such an attitude. Although, yes, we can choose to live in opposition of such an attitude, like that scene in the house of Eli, we too, like Eli's family, when choosing to live like this, will experience the due destruction our own sin brings. This is the truth, right, that we hear in Galatians 6:8, which says this, those who live only to satisfy their own sinful nature will harvest decay and death from that sinful nature. But those who live to please the Spirit will harvest everlasting life from the Spirit. When we seek to join our hearts with the God who made us, following the example of Hannah and Samuel, we too, I believe, will find ourselves saying, through the power of the Holy Spirit, speak, Lord, your servant is listening.